I could feel it before I saw it. The storm was coming, not just in the way the rain smeared the edges of the horizon or how the fog crept along the cliffs like a living thing, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. It was the weight in the air, thick and oppressive, pressing down on my chest until each breath felt labored. The car's tires hissed on the slick, muddy road, fighting against the pull of the rain as I neared Black Rock Bay, the village I had driven hours to reach. The trees lining the road seemed to groan under the weight of the wind, their skeletal branches stretching out like crooked fingers grasping at the darkening sky. It was the kind of sky that felt bruised, purple and heavy, ready to crack open with thunder. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, narrowing my eyes against the blurring rain. The road twisted ahead, leading me deeper into the heart of the unknown, where the earth met the endless sea. I had heard the rumors before. As a journalist, I had debunked myths and legends that others had feared. Ghosts, monsters, curses. None of it was new to me, but Black Rock Bay unsettled me the moment I first heard the name. It wasn't just a place steeped in superstition. There was something else, something darker beneath the surface, something even the most hardened skeptics couldn't ignore. Stories of the Shadow Keeper, a figure who haunted the village, taking the souls of the guilty during the darkest nights, had swept through the town like a wildfire. I laughed at the thought. Guilt? Souls? I'd seen worse, far worse than this. I was here to expose it for what it was, fear masquerading as myth. As I approached the village, the silence hit me first. There was no laughter, no chatter, no dogs barking in the distance, no children running through the streets. The village seemed abandoned, as though it had been suspended in time, waiting for something or someone. The village square came into view. The cobblestones shimmered under the dim glow of a single flickering street lamp. My headlights briefly illuminated an old sign that read, "Welcome to Black Rock Bay," but the words felt less like a greeting and more like a warning. The place seemed closed off from the world, encased in fog so thick it distorted the buildings and made everything seem distant, warped, like a reflection in a broken mirror. I parked the car, stepping out into the biting cold. The wind slapped my face with the brine of the sea, and the rain, though not torrential, chilled me to the bone. My coat clung to my skin as I stepped onto the wet cobblestones, my boots clicking sharply on the stones. The town was eerily still, save for the occasional gust of wind that cut through the narrow alleys, sending a chill down my spine. The houses stood like sentinels, dark, stoic, their windows blank and lifeless, as if the people inside were hiding, waiting for something to pass. The sensation of being an outsider settled over me like a heavy cloak. This wasn't just a village. I was intruding on something. I wasn't welcome here. And as my steps echoed down the narrow streets, I could feel the village watching me. The buildings, the street lamps, even the shadows seemed to observe my every movement. I was a trespasser in a place that had long ago decided who belonged and who didn't. I passed a row of crumbling buildings, the facades worn and weathered by the years. Yet there was a strange reluctance in the dim lights that glowed faintly through the windows. The shutters were drawn tight in most homes, but through cracks in the wood, I could make out faint shapes. Figures, eyes, watching me, calculating. A shadow flickered across the street, darting out of view so quickly that it almost felt like a trick of the mind. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat, but when I turned around, the street was empty. Get a grip, I told myself, you're being paranoid. But the unease lingered, wrapping itself around my chest like a vice as I made my way toward the tavern on the corner. Elias, the fisherman, was supposed to be my first contact, the one who could help me untangle the mysteries of Black Rock Bay. But with every step, the village seemed to grow more oppressive, more closed in, as if the very earth was trying to keep me here, to keep me from leaving. A cold, thick fog began to curl around my ankles, and the tension in the air grew, thick and suffocating. It was as if everything in Black Rock Bay, the buildings, the streets, the very stones beneath my feet, had been holding its breath, waiting for something. Or perhaps waiting for me. I reached the tavern. The heavy door groaned as I pushed it open, and the warmth inside hit me like a wall. But as I stepped across the threshold, the sensation hit me, the one I couldn't shake. The village was not just watching. It was waiting, and the moment I crossed into that dim, flickering light, I realized I wasn't just here to uncover the truth. I was part of it. The stories, the myths, the fear. It had all led to this moment. And Black Rock Bay, with its twisted secrets and its suffocating silence, had already sealed my fate. The door of the tavern groaned as I pushed it open, the sound heavy and reluctant, almost as if the building itself didn't want to admit an outsider. The air inside hit me immediately. Thick, heavy with the scent of salt water, mingled with the dense, curling smoke rising lazily from old pipes and stoves. It was the kind of smoke that stuck to everything, that made the whole place feel as though it had never fully aired out. The light was dim, flickering like a dying lantern, casting long, stretching shadows across the worn wooden floors. The tavern felt old, older than it should be, as if time had forgotten to move here, like it had outlived its purpose and was just waiting for something to close it off for good. As I stepped inside, shaking the rain from my coat, every eye in the room snapped toward me. The silence that followed wasn't the normal silence that comes with a newcomer entering a bar. No, this was different. This was thick, heavy with suspicion, as though everyone here had drawn in a collective breath and was waiting for me to make my move. The air itself felt charged, heavy with something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The quiet murmur of voices slowly began to rise again, but the eyes, they didn't leave me. They lingered on me, cold and calculating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about me, something about my very presence, was unwelcome. At the far end of the bar, I noticed a man sitting alone, hunched over a glass. His face was weathered, like someone who had spent too much time out on the sea, and his salt and pepper beard was unkempt, adding to the roughness of his appearance. His clothes were simple, practical, faded jacket, boots caked with the remnants of the ocean. But it was his eyes that caught me. He wasn't looking at me, but I could feel the weight of his gaze, sharp and intense, like he was watching my every move, even though he sat still as stone. The bartender, a grizzled man with a permanent scowl etched into his face, wiped his hands on a rag and looked at me with a kind of detached curiosity. "You looking for something, miss?" His voice was low and gravelly, the kind that comes from years of breathing in smoke and salt air. I hesitated, scanning the room quickly. "I'm looking for Elias. Elias Waters." The bartender's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something passing across his face. Without a word, he gestured toward the end of the bar where the fisherman sat. "He's in the corner. Don't bother him unless you've got a good reason." My curiosity piqued. I made my way toward him, each step muffled by the creaky old floorboards. As I got closer, I couldn't help but notice how unnatural his stillness seemed. It was almost as if he were carved from stone, as though he had always been a part of the bar itself. His hands rested on the bar, fingers wrapped loosely around a glass that had not been touched. The glass wasn't just an object, it was a symbol, an offering that had gone unclaimed, untouched, just as he seemed to be. When I reached the end of the bar, I cleared my throat gently. "Elias Waters, I'm Lila Rivers, a journalist." I'm investigating the local myths, particularly the story of the Shadow Keeper." For a long moment he didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the empty glass before him, and the silence stretched between us like a thread, taut and unbreakable. The bartender held his breath, as though waiting for something to snap. Finally, Elias lifted his eyes, and I felt the weight of his gaze, cold and unblinking, like the depths of the ocean. He studied me for a moment, sizing me up, measuring whether I was worth the effort of his attention. His eyes seemed to cut through me, sharper than I'd expected. There was something in his stare, something that made me feel as if he knew all the pieces of me that I tried so hard to keep hidden. "You've come to chase the ghost stories, have you?" he said, his voice low and gravelly, like the scraping of rocks against the shore. His lips curled into a grim smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The Shadow Keeper's no joke, miss. Some things are better left undisturbed." I could feel a flicker of frustration rise in me, but I held my ground. "I'm not here to chase ghosts. I'm here for the truth. People are scared of something, and I intend to find out why. There's no shadow in this village that can't be explained away. This keeper," I paused, my voice hardening, "it's just a story, a myth that's been passed down for generations." Elias's smile didn't fade, but there was a darkness in his eyes now, a shadow that deepened the more he looked at me. He lowered his head again, eyes dropping to the untouched glass in front of him. "That's what they all think. But the truth's a lot darker than you're willing to believe." I leaned in closer, feeling the pull of something deeper, something darker beneath the surface. What happened to Alistair Harrow? What is the real story behind the Keeper? At the mention of Alistair's name, Elias's hand twitched. For the first time, I saw his fingers flex, as though the mere mention of the past brought something to life in him, something painful, something he couldn't escape. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at me again, his gaze softer now, but the sorrow in his eyes was unmistakable. "You want to know what happened to Alistair Harrow?" His voice was barely a whisper, thick with something unspoken. "I'll tell you. But it's not something you'll ever forget. It's not something anyone should remember." He paused, his breath heavy, his gaze shifting away as though looking for something beyond the walls of the tavern, beyond the place where he and I sat. "I knew Alistair. We were close, like brothers." The words cracked slightly in his voice, and I saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, one that he quickly masked. "He was the one who uncovered the sins of this village. He thought the truth would set things right, that exposing what the elders had done would save us all, but it didn't. It only damned him." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What did the elders do?" Elias's face hardened, but he didn't respond immediately. His hand trembled slightly as he placed it on the glass, as if touching it somehow brought him closer to the past. He exhaled slowly, like a man preparing to dive into something he could not escape. "You'll find out soon enough," he said softly. "But if you're wise, you'll leave. The Shadow Keeper isn't something you can outrun, not even with all the truth in the world." I held his gaze for a moment longer, sensing the weight of something deeper, something darker than I had anticipated. Elias's warning was clear, but my instincts as a journalist refused to back down. This wasn't just about debunking a myth, it was about something far more dangerous, something wrapped in shadows that I had just begun to touch. And now, I was entangled in it. The fog thickened around me as I moved deeper into Black Rock Bay, my footsteps dragging me into the forgotten corners of the village. The town square, once filled with life, had fallen eerily quiet as dusk settled in. Only the faintest slivers of light filtered through the tightly drawn curtains of the windows, making the village feel like it was being swallowed by the mist. No, suffocated by it. The entire town seemed to be trapped in time, like a forgotten relic of the past, and no amount of rain could wash away the weight of history that clung to it. I pulled my coat tighter around me, feeling the chill of the damp air seep through. I had no idea what to expect from Margaret Moore, the historian Elias had told me about, but the house I approached was nothing like what I had imagined. Perched on the edge of the cliffs, overlooking the angry sea, it looked like it had been abandoned by time itself. The stonework was worn, chipped, weathered by salt and wind. Ivy clung to it desperately, as if the house were trying to hold on to the earth itself, resisting the pull of the ever-encroaching sea. The wind howled louder as I climbed the stone steps, carrying with it a warning that I couldn't quite grasp. Hesitantly, I lifted my hand to knock on the door, my knuckles brushing the cold wood. It creaked open almost immediately, as if the house had been expecting me. The woman who greeted me was nothing like I had imagined. Margaret Moore was tall, thin, her bones sharp beneath the layers of old wool and lace. Her face was lined with age, but there was something else in her eyes, something ancient, a vitality that seemed to defy time itself. Her pale eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You've come," she said in a voice that sounded like it had been pulled from the depths of a long-forgotten grave. "I knew you would. The storm always brings the curious." I blinked, taken aback by her unnerving certainty. "I'm Lila Rivers," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I'm a journalist. I'm investigating the legends of Black Rock Bay. I'd like to hear what you know about the Shadow Keeper." Her lips curled into a thin, unsettling smile. "The Keeper?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Ah, child, the Keeper is no myth. You cannot investigate something you do not understand. But come inside, we have much to discuss, and time is a luxury that the village no longer possesses." She stepped aside, allowing me into the house. It was like stepping into a forgotten library, filled with old books and dusty artifacts. The air smelled of aged paper and wax, with something metallic lingering in the background. An odd, unsettling scent I couldn't quite place. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with leather-bound books, their titles faded beyond recognition. Ancient maps of the coastline, some barely legible, hung on the walls. The furniture was sparse but sturdy, the windows large but clouded with the salt of the sea. Outside, the storm raged, and the sound of waves crashing against the cliffs reverberated through the house as if the sea itself were trying to break through. Margaret led me to a small sitting area by the fire. The flames flickered weakly, casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. She motioned for me to sit, her eyes never leaving me as I settled into the armchair. A long silence stretched between us, broken only by the crackling of the fire. I could feel her gaze on me, like she was studying me, searching for something hidden deep within. "You're like them all," Margaret finally said, her voice soft but sharp. "You think you can find answers where there are none. The Keeper will not be so easily dispelled. The truth you seek, it's not something you want to uncover." My heart skipped a beat. "I'm not afraid of the truth," I said, though I could feel the doubt creeping into my voice. "The Shadow Keeper is just a story. People here have let fear control their lives for too long. I'm here to prove it." Margaret's eyes flickered with something I couldn't place. Sorrow, maybe, or regret. "It's not fear that binds this village, Lila. It's guilt." "Guilt?" I frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Margaret turned away from the fire, walking slowly to a large wooden chest at the back of the room. She opened it with a creak, pulling out a bundle of faded papers and old journals. She placed them carefully on the table in front of me, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the brittle pages. "These are the records of Black Rock Bay," she said softly, "of the sins that have been hidden here for centuries. You will find, as I have, that the Keeper is not just a curse. It is a reckoning for all the wrongs that have been done, and for the secrets that have been buried beneath the surface." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. I reached for the papers, my fingers brushing against the yellowed pages. As I opened the first journal, the ink had bled through the years, the writing faint and hard to decipher. But the words were unmistakable. Alistair Harrow, the village elder who uncovered the sins of the past. My breath caught in my throat. Who was Alistair Harrow? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's face grew pale, her eyes distant, as though she were seeing something far beyond the walls of her home. Alistair was one of the villagers, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of sorrow. But he was also the one who uncovered the sins of the elders. He found out what they had done, what they had hidden, and he exposed it. He thought that by revealing the truth he could save us all. But he was wrong. The truth, it cost him everything. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. What did he find? What was the truth? Margaret's eyes darkened, her voice barely a whisper. The truth was that the village, the people you think of as harmless, have been hiding darkness for generations. The Keeper is not a spirit. It is the consequence of the betrayal, of the sins that were never paid for. Alistair was cursed, and now his shadow hunts us all. I shivered, the room growing colder despite the fire. But why me? Why am I tied to this? Margaret's gaze sharpened, piercing through my bravado like a dagger. You are part of the bloodline, Lila. Your family, your parents, they were involved in the past, more than you know. You may not have remembered, but the curse remembers. The weight of her words hit me like a tidal wave. I had come here seeking answers, but now I realized I had stumbled into something far darker, far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. Margaret's eyes held mine one last time, and for the first time, I saw something like pity in the old woman's gaze. The Keeper is coming, Lila. It always comes, and it will take everything from you, just as it has taken from all of us. The chill in my chest deepened. I had only just begun to understand the terrible history of Black Rock Bay, but one thing was clear. I was no longer just a journalist. I was part of the story, and now there was no escaping it. The night had plunged deeper into the heart of the storm. The wind howled like some wounded creature in torment, rattling the windows, shaking the very foundation of Margaret Moore's house. I had barely begun to digest the terrible truth she'd just revealed when something in the air shifted, something heavy and malignant. It wasn't just the storm anymore. No, this was something worse, something pressing, twisting, as though the very air was growing thicker, charged with a suffocating presence. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting long, tremulous shadows on the walls. But even the warmth from the fire couldn't dispel the cold that had crept into the room, sinking deep into my bones. Margaret hadn't spoken since her chilling revelation, and the silence between us felt like a weight. Every breath I took seemed too loud in the stillness, and every sound outside the house, the howling wind, the crashing waves, sounded amplified, as though the world was holding its breath. Then the wind changed. It had been shrieking just moments ago, a wailing scream through the rafters, but now it stopped, cutting off abruptly. The unnatural silence that followed sent a chill down my spine. I glanced nervously toward the window, but all I could see through the thick glass was the swirling gray fog and the angry waves crashing against the cliffs below. Margaret, her eyes closed, seemed lost in a sorrow too old to comprehend. Her face was a mask of grief, as though she had been waiting for this moment for far too long. She didn't speak, but I could feel the tension in the room growing. Something ancient, something terrible, was stirring beneath the earth, reaching upward toward us. And then it came. It wasn't a sound, it was a presence, cold, dark, and wrong. The air around me shifted, a barely perceptible change, and I felt it, the weight of it. The fire flickered and dimmed, the shadows in the room twisting into grotesque shapes, as though the darkness itself was alive, reaching for me. My heart hammered in my chest as I looked around, desperately searching for the source. I had heard the stories, whispers of a shadow, of a figure that could steal a man's soul, but nothing had prepared me for this. Nothing had prepared me for the sheer, suffocating terror that poured into the room like an unstoppable tide. And then it appeared. The figure was impossibly tall, shrouded in a cloak of pure darkness. It flickered in and out of existence, as though it was both here and not here at the same time. Its form warped and twisted, like a shadow cast by a dim flame, never quite stable, never quite real. The air around it seemed to warp, bending with the unnatural cold it exuded. The temperature dropped so fast that my breath turned to mist before my eyes. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the firelight, a hallucination caused by the erratic flickering. But no, this thing was real. It moved forward, defying all logic, as though it existed in two places at once, both here and somewhere beyond the veil of this world. And its face, or rather, what should have been its face, was nothing more than a void, an endless blackness where its features should have been. There were no eyes, no mouth, just a hollow abyss, an infinite darkness that threatened to swallow everything in its path. Its presence was unbearable. It pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, to move. The room felt smaller, the shadows closing in around me, the walls pressing in as if the house itself were fighting to hold together under the weight of this malevolent force. The cloak. It wasn't really a cloak, was it? It swept the floor like liquid shadows, a part of the night itself. The darkness seemed to devour everything in its wake, swallowing the light from the fire, suffocating the room in inky blackness. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat, choked by the terror that gripped me. I wanted to run, to escape this suffocating presence, but my legs wouldn't move. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, deafening, and Margaret's warning echoed in my mind, louder than any sound, colder than any wind. The keeper is coming. It always comes. It was here, the keeper. It loomed closer. And for the first time in my life I understood the true meaning of terror. Not the fear of the unknown or the supernatural. No, this was primal. It was a visceral, all-consuming dread that made me want to claw at my skin, to tear myself apart just to escape the suffocating weight of its presence. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. There was no sound, no voice, only the oppressive silence of its arrival. But I could feel it. I could feel the weight of it. Guilt, sorrow, anger, all of it. Suffocating, pressing down on me as though it were the embodiment of every sin the village had ever committed. It was the darkness, the weight of all the buried secrets, all the wrongs that had been done, pressing down on me like a physical force. And then it reached out. Tendrils of shadow, its shadow, extended from the figure, long and stretching, winding across the floor like snakes, reaching toward me, toward Margaret. Time seemed to slow as the darkness closed in around us, the temperature dropping further, biting into my skin like ice. Finally, my voice broke through, hoarse, desperate. "No, please, stop. The keeper's form seemed to pulse, as if it were listening to me. But the darkness was inevitable, an unstoppable force that could not be reasoned with. It continued to draw closer, the tendrils snaking toward my feet, curling around my ankles. And in that moment I understood. It wasn't after me, not yet, it was after Margaret. Margaret, who had lived in this house of secrets. Margaret, who had kept the darkest truths of Black Rock Bay hidden for so long. Margaret, whose bloodline was as entwined with the curse as mine was. It had come for her, the last piece of the curse that had to be paid. Margaret stood motionless, her face serene, almost expectant. She looked at me, her eyes filled with unspoken understanding, a sorrow that seemed to span lifetimes. "It's time," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible over the silence. I reached for her, but it was too late. The keeper's tendrils enveloped her, the shadows curling around her, pulling her toward the figure's unblinking, empty face. There was no scream, no sound. Only the cold, inescapable stillness as Margaret was consumed by the darkness. And then, the room was empty. The keeper was gone. The fire in the hearth sputtered out with a final, weak gasp, leaving only the dim light of the fading embers. The air was cold now, but it felt lighter, as though the weight of the curse had lifted for the moment. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where Margaret had been. The silence in the room pressed against my skin. I could still feel the lingering shadow, thick in the air, a bitter aftertaste I couldn't forget. The keeper had taken her. But I knew, the keeper hadn't gone. It had only bided its time. And it was waiting for me. The storm outside had finally relented, its violent howling fading into a soft, haunting whisper. The rain trickled down in steady rivulets, the world outside settling into a damp, eerie calm. The air had cleared, but it felt wrong, as though nature itself had been unsettled, holding its breath, waiting. The night was still, but the oppressive weight of the curse lingered in the shadows. Inside the house, the fire had long since died, leaving behind only the cold, as if the warmth had been siphoned away, leaving nothing but a chilling void. The room was dark, the faintest glow from the dying embers casting long, distorted shapes on the walls, like ghostly figures trapped in the aftermath of a nightmare. Lila was gone. Margaret was gone. Their sacrifices had been made. The cycle, the curse, had been momentarily broken, or so it seemed. The silence that filled the room was palpable, a heavy stillness that seemed to press against the very walls. But just as quickly as the silence settled, something else began to creep in. A faint rustling, like the whisper of leaves in the wind. Lila's sacrifice had been intended to break the curse, to end the terror that had haunted Black Rock Bay for so long. But the air had grown thicker, heavier with a presence that was not gone, but waiting, watching. Outside, at the edge of the village, where the cliffs met the crashing waves of the sea, something stirred. It began as a shadow, a faint, indistinct shape at first, flickering and fleeting like a trick of the light. But then it began to solidify, the darkness thickening, wrapping itself around the edges of the night. The village, still cloaked in mist, seemed to shrink beneath the weight of it, the very air seeming to tighten with every passing second. The shadow moved, slow and deliberate, its form growing more defined as it reached the edge of the village, closer to the heart of Black Rock Bay. It was smaller, yes, but it was no less dangerous. The shadows it cast were not natural. They bent and stretched in ways that defied reason, warping reality itself. It was the same shadow, only transformed, more twisted, more malignant than before. As the shadow inched closer, the village remained unaware, the homes dark and silent, save for the occasional flicker of a lamp in the distance. But in the silence, beneath the soft glow of the street lamps, a sense of unease began to settle over the land like a thick fog. The shadow crept through the streets, unnoticed by the few villagers who still walked the damp roads, huddled in their coats, heads down, too accustomed to the weight of the curse to question it. They had seen its form before, felt its presence, even if they did not recognize it for what it was. And yet, this time, something was different. It was a whisper at first, an unsettling sensation that clung to the edges of the village like a quiet murmur. The air grew colder, the shadows around each corner longer, more pronounced. It was as though the very village itself had come to life, its dark history swirling in the wind, binding the past and present together in a way that could not be undone. At the heart of the village, near the place where Margaret's house had stood, the shadow halted. It lingered for a moment, stretching toward the empty space where the old historian's house had been, where Lila's final act had taken place. It paused, as if acknowledging the sacrifice that had been made. But it did not stop. It did not end. Instead, it continued, creeping forward, moving ever deeper into the village. The figure, now fully formed, took shape. It was not the same as the Shadow Keeper had been. No longer a towering, shifting void, this shadow was smaller, hunched, like the first flicker of something monstrous growing into itself. Its edges were jagged, sharp, as though it had been torn from the very fabric of the world, frayed and ragged. It stood at the crossroads, its form flickering like a broken mirror, pieces of itself slipping in and out of view, as if it could not quite hold its shape. The darkness it cast stretched across the cobblestone streets, winding into the alleyways, curling around the stone buildings like a living thing. The villagers, still unaware of the looming threat, continued on with their lives. Unwittingly, unknowingly, part of a fate they had long ago sealed. They walked through the streets with their heads down, their faces averted, used to the strange cold that gripped the village, used to the silence that hung in the air like a curse. But the shadow knew. It was watching. It was waiting. And then, in the quiet of the night, the first of the shadows moved. A figure no taller than a child, but with eyes too old for its size. Its limbs were stretched unnaturally, angular and sharp, like the remnants of a broken dream. It moved silently, its feet barely touching the ground, the sound of its footsteps muffled by the heavy fog that had crept back into the streets. The shadow reached out, its tendrils stretching toward the unsuspecting villagers. A cold wind swept through the alleyways, the hairs on the back of Lila's neck prickling as if she could still feel it. The lingering presence, the terrible reality of what she had sacrificed for. And in that instant, as the new shadow moved through the streets of Blackrock Bay, something in the very heart of the village shifted. The curse had never left. It had only adapted. The villagers would not notice it at first, not for many years perhaps, but the shadow would be there, lurking in the corners of their lives, growing in the darkness. And when the time was right, when the village had forgotten enough, the shadow would claim them all. The curse had not been broken. It had only been passed on. And the cycle that could never be stopped, had begun again. The shadow crept into the night, its darkness mingling with the fog, its whispers carried by the wind. And Blackrock Bay, silent as always, waited for what would come next.